Hi everyone, welcome to Draw with Jan channel. In this video, I'm going to show you different techniques of watercolor painting. For trying this, you will need watercolor drawing papers, watercolor painting brush, watercolor in tubes or in pan, a cleaning cloth, and to try out different techniques, salt and a crayon, and a tissue paper. The first technique that I'm going to show you is called wet on dry. As you can see, I'm taking the right amount of paint and water in my brush and directly applying it to the dry surface. If you want a lighter shade of the same color, you could just add more water. This technique allows for more control over where your paint goes. You could also mix different colors in your palette depending on the shade that you need and directly apply it to the surface. You could also use different sizes of brushes for this technique depending on the size of your painting. Now moving on to the next technique, which is called wet on wet. As you can see, I'm using my brush to first apply water on the paper. Now I'm just going to take paint and apply it to the surface while the paper is still wet. This technique is usually used to cover large areas such as sky or water because this is very fluid and creates an unpredictable effect. Now I'm moving on to show you how to blend three different colors. First, I'm just using the wet on dry painting technique to add red and repeating that for orange and then finally yellow. Now we want the three colors to smoothly blend in without creating any visible lines. A couple of things that I'm doing here to achieve this: created a lighter shade of orange by adding in a little more water and using it in between orange and yellow, and just using water in my brush without any colors and going over the painting to blend it in smoothly. In the next technique, I'm going to show you how to lift colors from the paper when you've made a mistake or you just want to create white spaces on your drawing. Once you finish painting, while the surface is still wet, you could just use a tissue paper to dab it on the surface of the painting and remove the pigment. You can even try this technique with your brush. In the next technique, I'm going to show you what happens when you use crayons to draw something and then use watercolor paints over it. You will notice that crayons are not soluble in water and remains intact after you complete your watercolor painting. This is an easy technique to use where you can draw a subject and then add a nice watercolor background to it later. The next technique is called splattering. This can get really messy, so make sure you stick tapes around your paper that you can easily remove later on. I'm not using one here since this is just a working sheet. First, complete the underlying painting using any of the painting techniques that I just described. Once you're done with this, take some paint on your brush, use a different color paint, hold the bristles back, and launch paint on your canvas using your finger. Use thick or thin brushes depending on the effect that you'd like to produce. As you can see, this can get really messy, so prepare for it. Now I'm going to show you what happens when you add details to a wet surface versus a dry surface. As you can see, when you add paint to a wet surface, it is quite blotchy. Now repeat the same thing on a dry surface and you will notice that you can draw clearly defined shapes. Depending on the effect that you want to produce, you can choose to paint over a wet surface or a dry surface. Also, once you've completed a layer of coloring, you can still add water and paint all over it again. But you need to be really careful with this, since depending on the level of water, it can ruin your previous layer of painting. The more you experiment, the more you will learn about watercolors. The last technique that I'm going to show you is the one I love the most. First, I'm just adding a layer of paint using the wet on dry technique. This color seems light, so I'm just going to go over it again to create a darker version. And then I'm going to sprinkle some salt over it. Salt absorbs the watercolor pigments to create some really cool textures. Make sure you sprinkle salt while the surface is still wet. Now finally, remove the salt once the surface is completely dry and look at the amazing effect that it produces. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and found it useful. Thank you, and please follow my YouTube channel for more drawing videos. See you again soon.